I'd like to begin by acknowledging the unceded sovereignty of the Wallumattagal clan of the Darug Nation, whose lands we are gathered on today, as well as the Yuggera Ugarapul and Turrbal peoples, whose lands I conducted most of this research on, and to pay my respects to their elders past and present, and to extend that respect to any First Nations people in the room with us today. For my presentation, I'm going to be presenting an extract from my master's thesis, which focused on how various grassroots groups challenged the inclusion of police and corporations in Brisbane Pride. For some people, police inclusion is evidence of the monumental progress our communities have made, moving from criminalisation to celebration within the space of a few decades. For others, it's proof Pride marches have sold out to rainbow capitalism, that these Pride events have abandoned the notion of trans-queer liberation and instead prioritise the advancement of middle upper class white LGBTQIA people within the parameters defined by the colonial regime. Somewhat capturing this tension are these two images from 2020. On the left is a vigil and rally for Auntie Sherry Tilbury, who died in custody in a police watch house and whose family is still fighting for justice and accountability. On the right are gay cops at Brisbane Pride only a couple months later. They're promoting the Queensland Police Service and how proud they are to serve within an institution that systemically kills blackfellas. Rather than looking at arguments for or against police inclusion, my goal was to understand what these various contestations revealed about the operation of patriarchal white sovereignty within and beyond the settler colony of so-called Australia. Patriarchal white sovereignty is a concept theorised by distinguished Professor Eileen Morton Robinson. It describes a performative regime of power that imbues white male subjects, including white trans queer men, with a sense of belonging and ownership over sovereign and unceded First Nations territories. My research found that patriarchal white sovereignty didn't just operate within Brisbane Pride Incorporated, the body that organises the official Brisbane Pride. It was also active within the activist and organising groups who contested police inclusion and were ostensibly committed to decolonisation. For today's presentation, my focus is going to be on the participatory art demonstration carried out by Queer ACAB at the 2019 Brisbane Pride March. That's the Queer Anti-Capitalist Action Bloc. As an active participant in Queer ACAB, the literature would position my work as insider research. I'm uncomfortable with this framing, however, because it sets up a dynamic where my insider status is used to extract knowledge from the community under investigation. Instead, I aim to become a research accomplice. Indigenous action media theorise that an accomplice as academic would seek ways to leverage resources and material support and/or betray their institutions to further liberation struggles. This does not make me a good queer as juxtaposed against the bad queers who celebrate police inclusion. The idea that one can be a good anti-racist settler serves patriarchal white sovereignty by peddling the myth that it's possible to live on invaded First Nations territories without being implicated in colonising settler power structures. Rather than being a good researcher, my goal was to practice better solidarity and to meet the responsibilities and the obligations that emerge from my positionality as a white colonising settler. Rather than providing theoretical grounding for grassroots community organising efforts, my goal was to work with both disciplinary and activist organising knowledges, to clearly articulate the theoretical grounding that already exists within organising and activist praxis, while simultaneously applying methodological rigour to push the analysis further. Ugandan professor and freedom fighter Dani Wadada Nubadir describes this as synthetic knowledge production. While most rallies are a cacophony of chanting and raucous energy, Brisbane Pride is relatively quiet and demure, eerily so. Unlike most marches, the act of taking the streets does not affect the sense of a collective we. Brisbane Pride has become a collection of different groups walking next to each other, but not necessarily together. Breaking the individuated silence, the Queer ACAB block was loud and vibrant. For today's presentation, there's actually quite a lot I could talk about this moment, but for today's presentation, I'm interested in a moment which I describe as grounded theorizing. It was when a group of young trans queer folks marching nearby Queer Cab prompted us to start chanting, "Be gay, do crime." They were timid at first, speaking the words rather than shouting them, and the hesitation makes intuitive sense. Proudly advocating for people to be gay and do crime is anathema to the colonizing settler common sense. The confused looks on many rallygoers' faces when a chorus of voices chanted, "Be gay, do crime," suggests the catch cry confounds liberals, progressives, and conservatives alike. Why would trans queer people want to link being gay with doing crime when disentangling homosexuality from criminality has been a key goal of progressive LGBTQIA politics? I suggest partly to call attention to the hypocrisy of trans queer activists who can't see the contradiction between the movement's older goals of decriminalizing same-gender sex acts and gender nonconformity, and contemporary goals of expanding criminalization through hate crime laws. Or put differently, to critique the ways in which single-axis analyses of queer subjugation that ignore intersections of race, class, gender, ability, etc., tend to reproduce the very systems of oppression they are ostensibly fighting against. As Sarah Lamble puts it, pro-criminalization policies can only be sustained on the myth that the criminal justice system punishes those who deserve it, and that imprisonment is about safety, justice, and protection for all, and not about warehousing, caging, and punishing particular targeted populations. To be clear, I accept the claim that the mainstream LGBTQIA movement has made monumental progress. This is what allows me to live as openly and queerly as I do. My argument is that progress, that is inclusion, acceptance, and civil rights for trans queer people, describes the restructuring of post-colonizing heterosexualist power relations, shifting the categories of people targeted by state violence in order to preserve white domination. My contention is that colluding in the amplification of carceral violence against Black trans queer people has been the means by which white trans queer people have reduced our exposure to said violence. And I should say, when I say white, it's kind of a shorthand for proximity to middle-class whiteness. And so it's like predominantly white people, but also others. And we can talk model minorities and a whole lot of stuff. Rather than a radical break with the past, I suggest this redistribution of carceral violence formalizes what was always implicit to patriarchal white sovereignty, that police exist to protect white people and our stolen wealth and property against Black people. As James Baldwin sardonically observed, I think white gay people feel cheated because they were born in principle into a society in which they were supposed to be safe. The anomaly of their sexuality puts them in danger unexpectedly. Building on Maddie Day's analysis of Maria Lugones, I find heterosexualism to be an essential component to unpack Baldwin's claim. Within the coloniality of gender, heterosexualism does not refer to a normative sexual preference, nor a lived social practice. As Day explains, heterosexualism exposes a logic of categorization and dehumanization that ultimately determines which bodies are vulnerable to genocide. Heterosexualism puts white trans queer people in an ambivalent and contradictory position. Our white racialization provides us with access to the stolen wealth and land of colonizing settler invasion. However, this access is mediated by our sexual or gender expression, which under heterosexualism also legitimizes violence against us. Broadly speaking, rather than work to dismantle heterosexualism, which would entail dismantling the settler colony of Australia, white trans queer activism and organizing has been premised on differentiating between deserving and undeserving targets of state carceral violence. The formal decriminalization of homosexuality, institutionalization of LGBTI liaison officers, and inclusion of police in Pride means many white trans queer people are now able to see police as protectors. Violence against Black trans queer people continues because the criminalization of First Nations people was never premised on the criminalization of homosexuality or gender nonconformity. The criminalization of trans queer Black people is a continuation of the genocidal violence upon which colonizing settler societies are built. I conceptualize it in a way as there is a line dividing colonizing settler societies. On the one side of the line are the people police supposedly keep safe. On the other side of the line are people deemed social enemies, the people police keep other people safe from. This line is context specific and always in flux, with intersectional aspects of a person's subject position, sometimes putting them on different sides of the line in different circumstances. My argument is that post-colonizing settler state-mediated progress works to shift white trans queer people more firmly onto the police as protectors side of the line, while leaving everyone else, and especially Indigenous trans queer people, on the social enemy side of the line. In doing so, the line itself becomes more solid and ends up intensifying Black trans queer subjugation by concretizing the underlying structural violence. Rather than work to dismantle heterosexualist structures, progressive moves towards inclusion and equality work to increase white trans queer investments in patriarchal white sovereignty. In short, the inclusion of white trans queer people into the ranks of the protected citizenry is made possible through the amplification and entrenchment of police violence against everyone else, and especially Black trans queer people. As my fellow community organizer Shane pondered during our interview, by making claims to the powers that be for equal access or recognition, by participating as democratic subjects, are you legitimizing a democracy that is illegitimate? More than just legitimizing the post-colonizing invasion, my argument is that progressive reforms are a central component of how patriarchal white sovereignty works to reproduce itself. Progressive moves towards equality and inclusion feed into what Jody Bird describes as the meta-narrative that colonizing settler society is always progressing towards a more perfected, more inclusive union. From this perspective, empire building becomes a practice of co-option, whereby previously disenfranchised groups, such as white queers, are given space within the national imaginary, albeit on terms highly delineated by the heterosexual majority, in order to reinforce the hegemony of whiteness. Rather than ending heterosexualist violence, Baldwin's anomaly is resolved by giving white trans queer people formal equality with white heterosexuals. It's important to note that it's not just material investments in patriarchal white sovereignty that make it so attractive, but also effective, libidinal, and erotic investments that prey on our feelings of desire, pleasure, and repulsion. Agathangelo et al.'s work shows how the inclusion of good, deserving, homonormative trans queer people as equal citizens within white post-colonizing society is predicated on the simultaneous production of bad, undeserving social enemies. These internal enemies are labeled criminals, and the external ones are labeled terrorists. These not quite fully human non-citizens are deemed a threat to white society, and this threat must be countered by the expansion of racialized systems of state carceral violence, and imperial violence, I should add. Progressive moves towards inclusion and acceptance are therefore not incidental to the maneuverings of empire, but should be understood as tactics used to defend racial capitalism and patriarchal white sovereignty against radical movements for decolonization, abolition feminism, and trans queer liberation. LGBTQIA equality disentangles some of the internal inconsistency of post-colonizing heterosexualist power relations. It allows white trans queer people greater access to the stolen land and wealth of invasion, with less exposure to the associated structural violence. This inclusionary maneuver works to crystallize white possession, amplifying racialized transphobic and homophobic state violence, while simultaneously proclaiming systemic racism, transphobia, and homophobia obsolete. When the Queensland Police were invited to participate in Brisbane Pride, then Pride Inc. President Peter Black claimed, "The symbolism is really powerful because it is a sign of increased acceptance of the LGBTIQ community within the state." Of course, we are talking about inclusion within a colonizing settler state whose existence is premised on maintaining a genocidal invasion. So while I agree with President Black that police marching in Brisbane Pride is powerful symbolism, I argue it symbolizes a sinister Faustian bargain. Pride Inc. collaborates with post-colonizing systems of heterosexualist violence in return for white trans queer people being invited to deepen our investment in the reproduction of Australia as a white possession. As the Institute for Collaborative Race Research and Sisters Inside cogently summarize, The war of race has been raging in this place since first invasion and is as violent today as it was then. Racialized carceral violence has always been central to the reproduction of Australia as a white possession. This helps explain why white people in general are so invested in carceral institutions, including policing and prisons, and why white trans queer people and Pride Incorporated have been so ready to deepen their investment in these racist institutions the moment we are no longer systemic targets ourselves. And since these homonationalist processes of inclusion-exclusion represent a structural reordering of patriarchal white sovereignty, it is impossible for individuals to opt out. Complicity is inescapable because the law's proprietary interest in whiteness benefits all white people, regardless of what we believe or do. So where to from here? Coyley Driscoll et al. Suggest queer indigeneity challenges the very idea of civil rights and exclusionary complaints that grounds the mainstream GLBT movement. Instead, queer, Two-Spirit, and Two-Spirit Indigenous people are going after colonial nation states and challenging the racist and heterosexist foundations of theft and genocide they support and reproduce. With both the international and colonizing settler legal systems built on what Irene Watson describes as the genocide of colonialism, it should be no surprise these structures have proven incapable of ending genocide. Tim Lindrigan contends that strengthening the International Criminal Court must be coupled with alternative and more radical methods of enforcement and resistance. Building on the work of Eric Stanley, I suggest the recent revival of Marsha P. Johnson and Sylvia Rivera as icons of the Pride movement hints towards the radical resistance Lindrigan calls for. Stanley argues Marsha and Sylvia's chaotic splendor militantly unsettled the coercive gender normativity of both the dominant culture and the growing lesbian and gay activism of the early 1970s New York City. Taking inspiration from their commitment to live lives which were unintelligible to the liberal state, Stanley suggests becoming ungovernable might offer a pathway to collective liberation. Rather than seeking equality and inclusion, becoming ungovernable works to fracture, often in small or subtle ways, the various ways we are performatively interpolated as governable subjects. Juxtaposed against democracy as a scene of drifting chaos structured by racialized anti-trans queer violence, becoming ungovernable is an organized yet improvisational practice that valorizes expropriation. Partially captured by the notion of be gay, do crime, ungovernability is a politic grounded in collective care and solidarity. It means doing whatever it takes to ensure all, and especially Black, trans queer communities survive the heterosexual violence which underpins patriarchal white sovereignty and grounds globalized racial capitalism. Pulling this all together, I suggest Be Gay, Do Crime calls on trans queer people to refuse the poisoned chalice of progressive politics and the Faustian bargains of the colonizing settler state. Pushing against inclusion, equality, and acceptance as causes for celebration, Be Gay, Do Crime implies that trans queer liberation looks like abolition feminism and demands solidarity with criminalized people. I position Be Gay, Do Crime as a praxis of solidarity grounded in refusal. A refusal to accept the terms and conditions dictated by white colonizing settler regimes in favor of respecting First Nations terms of reference. Refusal as praxis takes inspiration from Murray resistance warriors who reject Australian citizenship, and the Mohawks of Kanawage who refuse the gifts of American and Canadian citizenship and instead insist upon the integrity of Haudenosaunee governance. In terms of Be Gay, Do Crime, refusal also means aligning ourselves with criminalized people by refusing to differentiate between legitimate and illegitimate targets of carceral violence. Refusal also means standing in solidarity with trans queer folks whose lives are unintelligible to liberal homonormativity. For white colonizers like myself, refusal means rejecting inclusion and acceptance within terms set by the colonizing settler state, terms that improve our standing within the post-colonizing heterosexualist hierarchy by reinforcing the subjugation of others, especially Black trans queer folks. Refusal also means disinvesting from our material, effective attachments to white control, mastery, and possession. Ultimately, The politics of refusal is central to how I respond to Eileen Morton Robinson's provocation that the real challenge for white feminists is to theorize the relinquishment of power so that feminist practice can contribute to changing the racial order. Thank you.